Welcome to the Lost Debate, show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and let's talk about some stuff that's in the news. And I think we could begin with Kash Patel, who is confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And I've talked about Kash Patel before, but he is an unconventional pick, both because he doesn't have a ton of experience managing people in law enforcement. Like, he held a few national security jobs for Trump, but really hasn't come up with the decades of experience that former FBI directors have. And those people also have a certain temperament that Kash Patel doesn't seem to have. You know, the traditional FBI director is somebody who has bipartisan consensus around them. You think about people like even Comey and Christopher Wray at various times were appointed by and approved by both Democrats and Republicans at various points, no matter what the politics were about those people as they went on. You know, we think about Wray was appointed by Trump. Comey was originally appointed by Bush and extended by, or Mueller was appointed by Bush and extended by Obama, right? So these are people who generally enjoyed some kind of bipartisan consensus and really went out of their ways to try to seem like they were impartial. Now, Patel does not appear to want to play that game at all. So he's the author of a book called Government Gangsters, which posits that the FBI is controlled by criminals. That book, Government Gangsters, includes an appendix that names 60 individuals as agents of the so-called deep state. Patel was pushed on this in his confirmation hearings, and this is where he's just trying to get the job. And honestly, I was like, he barely walked it back. He said it's not an enemies list, but he said it was meant to be a glossary. I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to mean. In a speech last year at CPAC, when he wasn't in front of the Senate, he was a lot more clear. He says, I'm going on a government gangsters manhunt. Who's coming with me? And he called it a blueprint for taking back the government. He said on his podcast, I'm not calling for any sort of harm to them physically, which is helpful to know. But he also has said, of course, we have to win in 2024 and send Donald Trump back to the White House so we can clean house of these government gangsters. That's what he told Roger Stone. He said, then we come back and then we prosecute every single one of them for continuing the criminal conspiracy that they started from Russiagate. He told a podcaster in 2022, my top priority would be to investigate the criminality within the government. I want to know who is involved with what, and I want to prosecute each and every one of those people. And this is a guy who has not just flirted with, but has outright stated conspiracy theories. He said on the War Room podcast in October, so this is not too long ago, he says there was no insurrection. They ginned it up. They, right? Talking about his extracurricular activities, in 2022, he published a children's book called The Plot Against the King, in which the villain is a shifty knight. This is a guy who's had a long-running beef with Adam Schiff, so the names there are not coincidental in all likelihood. And the shifty knight is outwitted by a clever wizard named Kash. Kash Patel also published two sequels, the last of which ends with King Donald and the wizard taming the fire-breathing Dragon of Jalapenos, DOJ, and turning it against cartoon characters modeled on Schiff, Biden, and Harris. Kash Patel has also created a brand called Fight with Cash and started a brand called Based Apparel, in which he has his $H symbol on all kinds of merch, including shirts, hoodies, socks, thermoses, flags, even wine. And the proceeds from the merch, Patel originally said, we're going to go to the Kash Foundation, which was set up to bring defamation lawsuits against news organizations. Let me remind you, this is the guy who's running the FBI now. Over time, the Kash Foundation expanded its mission to give grants to families of defendants in January 6th cases. And, Kash Patel has, as I've said, not been shy about talking about January 6th. He says that there were undercover FBI agents who were instigators who were responsible for provoking the attacks. He said, quote, how many people have been arrested and detained in the D.C. jails based on entrapment? Okay? That's the guy who's running the FBI. Now, who's his second in command? Now, there's been some reporting that Kash Patel reassured some Republicans behind the scenes that he was going to appoint a career person, in keeping with precedent, a career nonpartisan person to be the deputy director of the FBI, which, again, is precedent. But he has not done that. He has instead appointed Dan Bongino, 50-year-old host of the Dan Bongino radio show. This guy took over for Rush Limbaugh's syndicated show. Bongino has the 7th most popular podcast in the U.S. according to Podtrac. And this is a guy who's going to oversee domestic and international operations. And again, somebody who's traditionally a career agent. Now, Bongino has some law enforcement background. He was a NYPD officer and a Secret Service agent, but he has no experience running any divisions or any significant field offices and divisions within any law enforcement. And he's somebody who is probably even more of the sort of fringe right than, or I guess we can't call it fringe anymore because these people are in the highest levels of government, but the extreme right. He's even more extreme in some ways than Kash Patel. So he has repeatedly talked about how the election in 2020 was stolen. He has been named a super spreader of misinformation by media monitoring organizations because of, certain, people who are prominent seem to be trafficking in the ideas that Bongino has about how elections are stolen, how January 6th is an inside job, et cetera. One of those people who was trafficking in those ideas was Ashley Babbitt, who NPR reported had retweeted Bongino 50 times in the period before the Capitol attacks. Bongino has repeatedly criticized the very agency that he's now running, calling the FBI lost, broken, irredeemably corrupt. And he has said that the pipe bombs that were placed in the Capitol on January 6th were an inside job, and the FBI knows who the person is. Let's go to a clip of him talking about that.
Because I'm telling you, when this comes out, that the FBI knew the entire time the identity of this person and then tried to unknow it because it was an insider and an inside attack and a plot to, stop Republicans from questioning the election results.
And he also has had people like Rudy Giuliani on his podcast, and, he agreed when Giuliani was talking about how our elections were being stolen by Venezuelans who are counting our votes. This is the Dominion lawsuit. So this is the guy who's in charge, second in command in the FBI. So we now have a director and a deputy director of our nation's largest law enforcement agency who are fringe podcasters and kind of meme lords who are not even pretending to be impartial, and who are saying that their objectives are to root out criminality within the FBI. And it will make you wonder, well, okay, they're going to push a ton of people out. What's going to happen now with all the different things that the FBI does, which I know it's, you might have to, strain your memory to be like, well, what does the FBI do? Well, they take down, child sex trafficking rings. They go after child predators who cross state lines, serial killers, drug cartels, terrorists. They cooperate with law enforcement at the local level, both Democrat and Republican. And you got to ask yourself, is this a temperament and experience of the people you want doing that kind of stuff? Never mind, like, all this war that they're going to wage within the FBI and driving out people. They've already started to drive people out of the FBI. Is that going to be good for the safety of this country? And the question you got to ask yourself is, when inevitably bad things are going to start to happen for which we don't have the capability and the focus to investigate and stop within the FBI, are we going to have accountability here? Is Trump going to be accountable? Is Kash Patel and Dan Bongino going to be accountable? Or are they going to blame it on like DEI or some amorphous deep state plot to thwart them instead of taking responsibility as the heads of this agency? That's a question we need to ask. Now, in a couple of other pieces of news, in the Dispatch, Jessica Rydell wrote a really good piece called "The Republicans' Underwhelming Budget." And I'll quote from this because it's in line with some of the stuff I talked about in the last episode. Basically, you have the House and the Senate with different versions of the budget. But in talking about the House budget, this is what Rydell said. The new House budget resolution would likely add $3.3 trillion to the 10-year deficits. These costs will dwarf the largely symbolic DOGE budget savings and show a Republican government once again dramatically driving budget deficits upward. The Congressional Budget Office's latest baseline projections show Washington running a $21 trillion in budget deficits over the 2025 to 2034 period covered in the Republican budget proposal, pushing the federal debt held by the public from $29 trillion to $50 trillion. All signs point to steeply rising budget deficits. Baseline annual deficits were already headed towards $3 trillion within the decade due to growing Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments on the national debt. Even the $1.2 trillion mandatory program savings assigned to various committees assume a combination of Republican unanimity and aggressive budget cutting that has never happened before. The most likely outcome is that Congress ultimately reduces taxes, shelves most spending cuts, and sees interest rates rise further and brings deficits approaching $4 trillion within a decade. And so this is very much in line with what I've been talking about. And I'll link in the show notes also to a piece by Isaac Saul, our friend over at Tango, in which he goes through what liberals have been saying about budget deficit, what Republicans are saying about the budget deficit, and then he gives his take. And what is obvious there is that even you take the most aggressive Doge cuts into account, they're a drop in the bucket compared to the deficit problems that we're going to have under any reasonable reading of any legislation coming out of the House of Representatives and potentially the Senate. Okay, so that's where we are. There also is some interesting data about how consumer sentiment is dropping at a time when Trump's approval ratings on the economy are also dropping. So there's this University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, which I've talked about in this podcast. And this is often, a survey that just tells you, like, it's a lot of economists think it's the best survey out there, just how people view the economy. And consumer sentiment fell 10% in February to its lowest level since late 2023. This comes as Gallup last week registered Trump's worst economic approval rating ever. So that's where we are right now on the economy. I'll also link in the show notes to a piece from the Wall Street Journal that I found really fascinating when you think about like what's driving our economy right now. And this piece talks about how it's really the top 10% who are shouldering the burden of increasing GDP in this country. And this is, not just a Trump problem. This was true of the Biden administration as well. The top 10% of earners, quoting from this Wall Street Journal piece, and their households make about $250,000 a year or more. They've been doing okay. They account for 49% of all spending, which is a record dating back to 1989 when we started collecting this data. And the top 10% alone accounted for almost 1/3 of GDP in this country. But the piece goes on to say that there's some warning signs about that group in particular and how their sentiment is dropping, and that if their sentiment drops, our GDP, our growth, et cetera, could be struggling. And that's what the beginning of a recession could look like. And I continue to believe that we are at a huge risk of recession for reasons that I'll go into in more detail in future episodes. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Keep sending in those voicemails. Our number is 321-200-0570. If you haven't yet, leave a qualitative review on Apple or Spotify. Say what you love about the show. Give us 5 stars. And you can also send in questions or comments via email, lostdebate@thebranchmedia.org. Talk to you soon.